Germany is a pile of trash, where 40 million hungry Germans rummage. This is how post-war Germany was described by one journalist. Indeed, the fate of the country was unenviable. After being defeated in World War II, the country lost 29% of its territory. What remained was divided into 4 occupational zones. Over 7 million men perished, and more than 2 million were mutilated. In addition to this, Germany had to pay reparations to the victorious countries amounting to $500 billion, and the victors had the opportunity to extract resources, factories, and even entire power stations from Germany. Yet within just 3 years, the country managed to return to pre-war levels of production, and by the mid-1960s, Germany became the most industrially developed country in continental Europe. Cars, machinery, food, medicine, Germany conquered the whole world. How did a destroyed country manage to become the most industrially developed country in Europe in just 20 years? And why did the USA, which fought against the Third Reich, actively invest in the welfare of German citizens? Questions regarding post-war development in Germany began to arise even before the end of World War II, and were actively discussed at the Yalta Conference of 1945. Germany was divided into 4 sectors or occupational zones of influence: Soviet, British, American, and French. However, while the Soviet zone of influence developed autonomously on December 2, 1946, the American and British sectors of influence were merged into one, which was named Bizonia, from Latin bi to, and English zone, territory zone. This name has nothing to do with horned animals. Bi in Latin means two, and zonia from zone means territory or zone. This was done to simplify economic relations and political management. Later, in 1949, the French sector of occupation joined Bizonia, forming Trizonia, which in the same year, 1949, was transformed into the Federal Republic of Germany. In the same year, the Soviet occupation zone was transformed into the German Democratic Republic, GDR. West Berlin had a separate status. With this, the post-war division of Germany came to an end. History is written by the victors. Defeated Germany was entirely in the hands of the Anglo-American Soviet coalition. The decisions on how the country would develop were made across the ocean. There were 2 options. One was the Morgenthau Plan. According to it, the country's industry should be completely destroyed and Germany itself divided into several small states. However, this plan was not adopted. Firstly, other capitalist countries feared the spread of communism, and Germany had a significant border with the socialist bloc, essentially serving as a bastion of capitalism in the East. Hence, it needed to be strong, primarily economically. Secondly, the worldwide expansion of the dollar and American goods in Europe had begun, and for this, Germany needed to be wealthy. Therefore, instead of the Morgenthau Plan, the Marshall Plan was adopted, Marshall Plan, which entailed significant economic aid to the defeated country. There were plenty of problems for restoring Germany's economy. Firstly, many factories were either completely destroyed or taken to the victorious countries. Let's take just one example, the BMW factories. The factories located in Brandenburg were taken to the USSR, while the factory in the suburbs of Munich was destroyed. Secondly, there was a lack of skilled labor. Many men had died in the war or became disabled, and many engineers who had collaborated with Hitler, and the overwhelming majority did, fled Germany, some to the USSR, others to the USA. The most famous example is the rocket engineer Wernher von Braun, the developer of the V-2 rocket, and subsequently one of the fathers of the American space program, and he was far from the only one. Additionally, there was gender inequality. In the USSR, women worked alongside men, and there were many skilled female engineers, workers, and leaders. It was not so in the Third Reich. Most women were engaged in family and household duties. They did not have higher or specialized technical education and work experience in production. Plus, in the last years of the war, almost all industry had been converted to military production. The same firm, BMW, during the war, produced engines for airplanes and rockets. Now military production in Germany was prohibited, and technical documentation was taken to the victorious countries. Moreover, the country's banking activity was entirely destroyed. Black market flourished. Products were distributed on ration cards, not to mention the morale of the residents of the defeated country. So how were these problems addressed? Surprisingly, the problem of lack of skilled labor was the first to be solved, as people from territories relinquished to the USSR and Poland began to come to Germany. Thanks to them, Germany's population increased by over 2 million people. Secondly, Germany's economic crisis played a positive role in industrial development. Labor was cheap. At the same time, the excellent German quality was renowned worldwide. Thirdly, Americans began to supply Germany with both new technologies and machinery. Fourthly, military factories were converted to produce consumer goods. And the first buyers of German products were, surprisingly, the British and Americans. Let's take just one example. This is one of the most famous cars of the 20th century, the Volkswagen Beetle, also the most mass-produced car in history, with over 21 million units made. It is a symbol of the 1950s and 1960s. However, few people know that its production started way back in 1945. The first 50 cars were produced then for the needs of the British Army. They required cheap and reliable vehicles, which led to a subsequent order for another 20,000 units. In America or Britain, the production of similar cars would have cost much more. That's why, until the late 1940s, cars were produced exclusively for military needs, but the orders were stable. And then the cars went on general sale and became very popular among ordinary people in Germany. Other German auto companies were not lagging behind. BMW was unable to produce cars, but they started manufacturing cheap motorcycles. Part of the Opel factory was transported to the USSR. That's when the production of Moskvich 400 began, which is a copy of Opel Kadett. However, the factory received a large order to produce trucks for the American Army. The Audi factory also began manufacturing motorcycles as well as small microbuses. By the early 1950s, the German automotive industry had reached its pre-war production levels and continued to actively develop. Surprisingly, the Korean War of the 1950s also aided in the development. Germany became one of the main suppliers of vehicles for the American and British armies. Thus, North Korea inadvertently influenced the development of German car manufacturing. One of the steering figures of the German economic miracle was Ludwig Wilhelm Erhard, a prominent economist. Under his guidance, a monetary reform was carried out. Unbacked money was withdrawn during the exchange of Reichsmark for the new German mark at a ratio of 10-1. A price liberalization was carried out, resulting in the quick disappearance of the black market, and goods finally appeared in stores. Meanwhile, the government regularly printed catalogs with recommended prices. Several particularly important sectors, such as energy, were state-controlled. Also, an exchange rate of the mark to the dollar was established. However, currency could only be converted with state permission. Gradually, salaries began to grow, along with purchasing power. But most importantly, the revenues earned by merchants were not spent on consumption, but were invested in production development. The main focus was not on large corporations, but on small and medium-sized businesses. By the mid-1950s, the domestic German market was filled with goods, necessitating entry into foreign markets, which led to an artificial devaluation of the mark. It dropped by a third against the dollar. As a result, German goods became more competitive in the global market. First and foremost, German cars were in demand. In the 50s, the Volkswagen Beetle became the most popular car in Europe. It was a truly people's car, and not just in Germany. Of course, Germany sold not only cars. Although their production increased more than sevenfold from 1948 to 1953, household appliances were also sold. Bosch refrigerators, Siemens appliances, Grundig home electronics, and many others were well known. The pharmaceutical industry was actively developing. It's worth mentioning the German corporation Bayer. It was revived in 1952, with leaders at the helm who were convicted during one of the Nuremberg trials and had fully served their sentences. Americans actively invested in the company. Bayer was one of the first large German companies to open branches in third countries. In 1954, the company started operating in the USA, and a little later in India and Pakistan. Alongside this, whole residential blocks were being built in Germany. There were no makeshift accommodations. Instead, houses were built to last for centuries. There were numerous mortgage programs, including for the low income. Large families were given interest-free housing loans for over 30 years. As a result, by 1963, there were 30 apartments for every 100 Germans. This was at a time when the USSR had just begun building affordable housing. Most urban residents lived in communal apartments. Affordable housing outside the cities was actively developed, and getting a small house with a land plot was cheaper than a city apartment. The German economic miracle ended in the mid-60s. By this time, Germany had high salaries and a very strong social welfare system. This placed a serious burden on businesses. German goods ceased to be competitive. The same Volkswagen was on the verge of bankruptcy by the end of the 60s. Japanese auto manufacturers were catching up. The energy crisis of 1972 to 73, where energy resources significantly increased in price, played an important role. The growth of production almost slowed down, but the economy was saved by small and medium-sized businesses, as they are always more mobile than large corporations. However, unemployment began to rise, especially among migrants from Turkey and Yugoslavia, who were actively employed in the 60s. So what solution did the Germans find? In the 70s, Germany, like many other European countries, began transitioning into the post-industrial era. Since energy resources in Europe were expensive, it was decided to relocate a large portion of energy-intensive and environmentally unclean productions to third-world countries. Essentially, only high-tech manufacturing remained in Germany. Germany began to move its money to other countries. In the 70s, about 30% of German funds were invested in foreign productions, thus creating a fully fledged parallel economy. Large international corporations started playing a much bigger role. Sales markets significantly expanded, and a new economic upswing began in the mid-80s. By the way, one of the main buyers of German goods were countries of the socialist bloc. All of this led to the fact that by 1990, Germany's economic indicators reached their highest levels in the last 20 years, but the happiness was short-lived. Germany faced an unprecedented crisis at that moment. There were several reasons. Firstly, Germany united into one country. The GDR was much less developed industrially. Accordingly, it required huge investments, essentially becoming a subsidized region. Only in the first half of the 90s, more than 500 million German marks were invested in the Eastern Territories, and a large part was invested not in industry, but in social infrastructure. Essentially, the money was going nowhere. The collapse of the socialist camp also played an important role in the crisis. Germany lost a large market, and as a result, German goods were quickly replaced by cheaper Turkish or Chinese ones. The outflow of capital abroad began, and a fairly strict regime of state funds economizing was introduced. Nevertheless, the problems began to be solved. Tax reform was carried out, the integration of East German enterprises into the economy took place. A special place should be given to scientific reform. Until the 90s, Germany mainly used foreign scientific developments, but then huge funds began to be invested in new technologies. As a result, the country quickly started exporting its own technologies. Currently, Germany's economy continues to hold the first place in Europe, and after the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union, Germany has only strengthened its position. However, not everything is so rosy. The prosperity of the German economy was largely facilitated by cheap energy resources such as gas or oil, which Germany received from Russia. Now the situation is changing, there are no deliveries, the environmental lobby is demanding a quicker transition to renewable energy sources, which are much more expensive. The situation is exacerbated by fierce competition with countries from Southeast Asia, plus the aggravation of social issues and the aging of the population. At present, the average age of a German resident is 44 years old. For reference, in USA and China, 38. The number of retirees is growing, and they all want to receive larger pensions. The social crisis worsened during the pandemic, when a large part of the enterprises was not operating, but people were receiving decent benefits. Problems between the indigenous population and immigrants from the East and Africa are escalating. Will these problems lead to a new crisis? How powerful will it be, and will the Bundestag be able to bring the country out of it this time? We will see very soon. But one thing can be said for sure, Germany is not the same country now that was able to create an unprecedented economic miracle 80 years ago. We are curious to hear your opinion about this video in the comments. At this point, we get to the end of our video. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon, and give this video a big thumbs up. This will only take a split second, but surely pump the YouTube algorithm to bring our videos to the top. See you in the next video.